Jessica and Sarah were excited to start their sophomore year together in a dorm that felt a bit more like home than the bland rooms of their freshman year. The two had known each other since high school and felt relieved to share a space with someone they trusted. Their dorm was cozy, filled with laughter, late-night study sessions, and shared memories. But after only a few weeks, a creeping unease settled into the room, casting a shadow over their once warm haven. It began subtly enough. Jessica first noticed it one morning when she found an unfamiliar coffee mug sitting by the sink. Assuming Sarah had picked it up somewhere, she shrugged it off and went about her day. However, when she mentioned it later, Sarah blinked in confusion. "That mug? I thought it was yours," Sarah replied, examining the chipped, faded ceramic that neither of them could place. They brushed it off as something one of them might have forgotten, but the strangeness didn't stop there. Soon, more objects appeared. A yellowing book with no cover, a crumpled pair of socks lying next to the couch, a tiny porcelain doll resting on the windowsill. "Maybe someone's messing with us," Sarah suggested one night, peering around the room suspiciously. But neither could think of anyone with both the access and the inclination to play such an elaborate prank. One night, Jessica awoke with a start. She had a strange feeling, an instinctual chill that prickled her skin and made her heart race in the darkness. She glanced at her phone. 3:14 a.m. Something felt wrong, but she couldn't place it. The room was still and silent, except for Sarah's steady breathing from the other bed. She brushed it off as a nightmare and tried to fall back asleep, but a nagging feeling kept her restless until dawn. As the days went on, they both began to feel increasingly uneasy, as if someone or something was watching them. They caught glimpses of strange shadows at the edges of their vision, heard faint shuffling noises in the middle of the night, and began finding their personal items inexplicably moved or misplaced. Jessica found her phone in the kitchen one morning when she swore she had left it charging on her nightstand. Sarah's shoes were often scattered across the room, though she always kept them by the door. "What if we're just imagining things?" Jessica said, her voice trembling with forced laughter. But she could see the fear mirrored in Sarah's eyes. Neither of them dared to acknowledge it out loud, but they both knew that something in their dorm wasn't right. Finally, desperate for answers, they decided to set up a small camera in the corner of the room. If someone was sneaking in, they would catch it on tape. Sarah set it up before they went to bed, making sure it was angled to capture the entire room. They laughed nervously, pretending this was all a joke, but beneath the surface, they were both terrified. That night was one of the longest of their lives. They lay awake, both feigning sleep but acutely aware of each other's nervous breathing. Every creak and shift of the dorm seemed amplified in the silence, each noise causing them to tense in fear. Finally, exhausted, they drifted off. The next morning, Jessica woke up first, immediately reaching for the camera. They sat down together to watch the footage, both trying to act braver than they felt. For the first few hours, nothing happened. The camera captured them sleeping peacefully, the occasional car headlights flickering through the window. But then, at exactly 3:13 a.m., the camera picked up movement. A dark shape appeared in the doorway. Jessica and Sarah froze, watching as the figure slinked silently into the room, barely more than a shadowy outline. It moved with an unnatural, jerky motion, as if its limbs were bound by invisible strings. Their breaths caught as the figure approached Jessica's bed, looming over her for what felt like an eternity. Then, it turned slowly, mechanically, and drifted over to Sarah's side, hovering just inches from her face. The figure seemed to watch her, its head tilting unnaturally, as if studying her every feature. Then, with a deliberate slowness, the figure reached into its pocket and took something out, a tiny, delicate piece of paper, which it tucked under Sarah's pillow. The figure lingered for a moment longer before retreating back toward the door, slipping out of the room just as soundlessly as it had arrived. Jessica and Sarah sat in stunned silence, both too afraid to move. It felt as though they had been turned to stone, frozen in place by the dread clawing at their insides. What was that?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. They didn't have an answer. After a long silence, Jessica and Sarah forced themselves to check under Sarah's pillow, where they found a small, crumpled piece of paper. Shaking, Sarah unfolded it, revealing a few hastily scrawled words in faint, almost illegible handwriting. "I've always been here." A shiver ran down Sarah's spine, and she looked at Jessica, her eyes wide with fear. Neither of them could understand what was happening, but the message made it clear that whoever, or whatever, this figure was, it wasn't just some prankster sneaking into their room. They didn't sleep at all the next night, instead watching the door with a mixture of dread and determination. But despite their vigilance, the room remained still, the hours crawling by until dawn finally broke. Over the next few days, more notes appeared, always tucked beneath one of their pillows. Each message seemed more cryptic than the last, but the words felt cold, as though laced with a chilling intent. "Why don't you see me?" One note read. Another, left under Jessica's pillow, simply said, "Tonight, I'll be closer." The cryptic notes seemed to pull at their minds, leaving them jumpy and paranoid. Every sound, every shadow seemed like a threat, an ominous sign that they were not alone. Both girls started experiencing nightmares, vivid and unsettling visions that seemed to plague them night after night. Jessica dreamt of someone standing over her, whispering things she couldn't understand, words that left her feeling hollow and drained. Sarah's nightmares were more chaotic. She was running through the dorm, doors slamming shut behind her, footsteps echoing just out of sight. By the end of the week, their exhaustion was obvious. They were constantly glancing over their shoulders, whispering anxiously, double-checking every corner of the room before they dared to fall asleep. But sleep wasn't the refuge they had hoped for. It seemed to draw them deeper into the nightmare. Desperate for answers, they decided to check the footage again, dreading what they might see. It felt like madness to willingly watch the haunting scenes unfold, but they needed to know if they were truly alone or if something sinister was indeed sharing their space. The footage started normally, showing them settling into bed, shifting uncomfortably as they struggled to fall asleep. For hours, nothing happened. And then, right around 3 a.m., the dark figure appeared again. This time, the figure's movements were more deliberate, and it carried something, a long, tattered piece of fabric that it dragged across the floor. It moved to the center of the room, standing there in silence, as if waiting for them to wake up. But neither of them stirred, caught in the grip of whatever nightmare was holding them captive. Then the figure did something chilling. It turned slowly towards the camera, its face obscured, and raised a single hand, pointing directly at the lens. It held the pose for a long, tense moment before lowering its hand and returning to Jessica's bedside. The figure leaned down, close to her face, whispering something inaudible. Finally, it turned away and slipped back into the shadows, disappearing from view. Shaken and terrified, Jessica and Sarah rewound the footage, trying to decipher the figure's whisper. But the sound was faint, barely a hiss, though it grew louder as they strained to listen. Finally, they could make out a few words. "You can't hide." The phrase echoed in their minds, filling them with dread. They began to wonder if the figure was watching them at all times, even when they weren't aware. It felt as though they were being hunted, stalked by an unseen presence that thrived on their fear. As the days wore on, Jessica noticed changes in Sarah. She was quieter, distant, as if something heavy had settled over her. She refused to discuss the dreams or the footage, brushing off Jessica's concerns with forced smiles and dismissive laughter. Jessica tried to convince herself that things would get better, but she felt an unshakable fear that something was slipping away. One night, Jessica woke with a start, her heart racing as a cold sweat drenched her skin. She could feel someone close to her, standing by her bed, watching her with an intensity that felt almost physical. She lay still, too frightened to open her eyes. And then she heard it, a whisper, soft and sinister, inches from her ear. "Open your eyes," the voice urged, filled with a dark eagerness. She felt a chill as the whisper pressed closer, so close that she could feel the icy breath on her skin. Jessica's eyes snapped open, and she looked around the room, but no one was there. She turned to Sarah, who lay still in her bed, fast asleep. But something was wrong. Sarah's face was pale, her skin almost translucent, her eyes tightly shut as she muttered strange words in her sleep. It was as though she was having a conversation with something unseen, her whispers low and eerie, her fingers twitching against the sheets. As Jessica leaned in, she could barely make out the words. So close, can't escape, we'll be together. A feeling of dread filled her, and she backed away, terrified by what she had witnessed. The following morning, Jessica confronted Sarah, but Sarah only looked at her with empty eyes, as though she didn't remember a thing. Her responses were distant, her demeanor almost robotic. Jessica began to suspect that whatever was haunting their room had somehow gotten to Sarah, ensnaring her in its grip. When Jessica finally mustered the courage to bring it up, Sarah's expression twisted with a strange, almost mocking smile. "What's the matter, Jess?" she asked, her voice carrying a chilling edge. "Don't you trust me anymore?" Jessica's stomach churned with fear. The girl sitting across from her looked like Sarah, but there was something wrong, something dark lurking behind her eyes. Jessica realized with a sinking dread that their mysterious visitor wasn't just haunting the room anymore. It was in their minds, twisting reality, and perhaps even controlling Sarah. As Jessica lay awake that night, her heart pounding in her chest, she couldn't shake the feeling that her best friend was slipping away. But she was determined to find out the truth, no matter the cost. And as she drifted into a restless sleep, she was certain of one thing: whatever was haunting them wasn't finished. The nightmare was only beginning. After that night, things only grew worse. Sarah's behavior became increasingly strange. Her eyes often glazed over, as if she were somewhere else entirely. She'd mumble things under her breath, her gaze distant, and whenever Jessica tried to bring it up, Sarah would laugh it off, dismissing her concerns. But Jessica knew what she'd seen. Something was changing her friend. One evening, Jessica decided she had to figure things out on her own. She needed to understand who, or what, was invading their lives. After Sarah had fallen asleep, Jessica slipped out of bed and started going through Sarah's things, hoping to find a clue, anything that might explain her friend's erratic behavior. At first, her search seemed pointless. There was nothing unusual, just textbooks, a few scattered papers, clothes. But then she found something strange, a small, folded piece of fabric tucked under Sarah's mattress. As she unfolded it, her heart skipped a beat. It was the same tattered cloth she had seen the figure carrying on the footage. Her hands shook as she held it up to the dim light, noticing odd symbols drawn in faded ink across the fabric. They looked like some kind of ritual markings, twisted symbols that sent a chill down her spine. She dropped it quickly, as if it burned her fingers, and backed away from Sarah's bed. The next morning, Jessica didn't mention what she'd found. She wasn't sure what it meant, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this cloth was somehow connected to their nightly visitor. She spent the day avoiding Sarah, pretending everything was fine, while trying to figure out what to do next. But Sarah noticed her distance and cornered her as soon as they were alone in the dorm. "Why are you acting so strange, Jess?" she asked, her tone laced with something darker, something that wasn't quite her. Jessica tried to play it off, but Sarah's eyes narrowed, her stare unblinking and cold. "You know, don't you?" Sarah said softly, a hint of a smirk tugging at the corners of her mouth. Jessica's heart raced as she forced herself to remain calm. "Know what, Sarah?" she replied, her voice trembling. "You found it, didn't you?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper, yet it cut through the silence like a blade. Jessica took a step back, feeling the wall press against her as she tried to distance herself from her friend, who seemed like a stranger now. Sarah's smile grew, a twisted expression that filled Jessica with dread. "Why are you doing this?" Jessica managed, her voice barely audible. But Sarah didn't answer. She simply turned and walked away, humming a tune that Jessica didn't recognize, yet somehow felt chillingly familiar. That night, Jessica was too afraid to sleep. She stayed up, clutching a flashlight, her eyes darting around the room, watching for any sign of movement. Around 3 a.m., she heard the door creak open. Her heart thundered as she aimed the flashlight at the doorway, but the beam only illuminated empty space. Yet, the room felt wrong, filled with a sense of oppressive, suffocating presence. Moments later, a shadow began to stretch across the floor, moving closer and closer to her bed. Jessica held her breath, paralyzed by fear, as the shadow crept toward her, inching closer with each passing second. She squeezed her eyes shut, praying it would go away, but then she felt a cold touch on her arm. Her eyes flew open, and she found herself face to face with Sarah. But it wasn't really her friend standing there. It was something else, wearing Sarah's face with eyes that looked wrong, hollow and dark, like empty voids. Jessica tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. "Jessica," the figure whispered, its voice distorted, as though several voices were speaking at once. "Why do you resist?" Jessica struggled to break free, to move or speak, but her body wouldn't obey. She felt trapped, immobilized, as the figure leaned closer, its face hovering just inches from hers. "Don't you want to be part of us?" it asked, its voice sending chills down her spine. Finally, with every ounce of strength she had, Jessica managed to jerk away, falling to the floor. She scrambled backward, never taking her eyes off the figure as it slowly straightened, its expression twisted into a malevolent grin. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it faded into the shadows, leaving Jessica alone, trembling in the darkness. Jessica didn't sleep for the rest of the night. She stayed curled up in the corner, clutching her flashlight, watching Sarah's bed as if expecting the figure to reappear at any moment. When dawn finally broke, she stumbled out of the dorm, determined to get help, to find someone who could help her escape this nightmare. She went to the campus counselor, desperate to share her story, to make someone believe her. But as soon as she started explaining, the counselor's expression shifted to one of polite concern mixed with disbelief. Jessica could tell the woman thought she was simply sleep-deprived, stressed from classes. And without any proof other than her own terrified words, Jessica felt helpless. Reluctantly, she returned to the dorm, hoping maybe she'd find a way to survive until she could leave. But when she opened the door, she found Sarah sitting on her bed, a strange smile on her face. "Did you miss me?" Sarah asked, her tone taunting, mocking. Jessica took a step back, clutching the door frame as she felt that familiar, suffocating presence settle over her once more. I know what you are," Jessica stammered, her voice barely a whisper. Sarah's expression darkened. She rose slowly, crossing the room in a way that seemed both familiar and horribly unnatural. "No, Jessica, you have no idea what I am," she whispered, her face inches from Jessica's, eyes staring unblinkingly into hers. Jessica felt a chill creep over her, as if ice were seeping into her veins. "I'm not Sarah anymore," the figure whispered, a faint smirk pulling at the corners of her mouth. "Sarah's gone. She let me in." Jessica felt as though the floor were crumbling beneath her, her mind racing as she tried to process what she was hearing. Her friend was gone. This thing, this malevolent presence, had taken over, pushing Sarah's soul aside, leaving only a hollow shell. With a sudden surge of determination, Jessica turned and ran, tearing out of the dorm and into the empty hallway, her footsteps echoing in the silence. She sprinted down the stairs, her heart pounding, each step feeling like it took a lifetime. She didn't stop until she was outside, the cold night air hitting her like a slap, waking her from the horror she had just faced. But even as she stood there, gasping for breath, she could feel that presence lingering, a dark force watching her, waiting. This nightmare was far from over, and Jessica knew that as long as she stayed, the entity that had taken Sarah would continue to hunt her. But where could she go? Jessica didn't return to the dorm that night. She spent hours wandering the campus, trying to make sense of what had happened. But her thoughts were a jumbled mess. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward her. Every faint sound made her jump, and her own footsteps echoed ominously in the quiet night. Eventually, she found herself on a bench by the library, watching the sky grow lighter as dawn crept in. The nightmare had become real, but she didn't know who to turn to or where to go. That morning, Jessica contacted her friend Mark, someone she trusted and who was known for his interest in paranormal phenomena. She had always thought his theories about ghosts and spirits were just quirky hobbies, but now she needed his help more than ever. She didn't tell him everything over the phone, only enough to get him to meet her in the library, away from prying eyes and ears. Mark listened as Jessica recounted the horrors she'd experienced. She watched his face go from curiosity to horror, and finally, to deep concern. When she finished, he was silent for a moment, processing everything. "Jessica, what you're describing, it sounds like some kind of possession or attachment," he said finally, his voice low. "Entities like this, they feed off fear and despair. It might have latched on to Sarah because she was vulnerable in some way, but now it's going after you." Jessica's hand shook as she clutched her coffee cup, her mind racing with a dozen questions. "What do we do?" she whispered, her voice barely holding steady. "We need to go back to the dorm," Mark said, though his tone carried a hint of dread. "We have to confront it directly. If we're careful, we might be able to weaken its hold. Sometimes these things leave traces, a mark, an item, something it's using to anchor itself to your friend." Jessica felt a chill run down her spine at the thought of returning, but she nodded. She was terrified, but if there was a chance to save Sarah, she had to try. Together, they waited until the evening, preparing themselves mentally and gathering what few items Mark thought might help. Salt, an old medallion he claimed had protective properties, and a small bundle of sage. It wasn't much, but Jessica clung to the idea that it might be enough. They reached the dorm just as the sun was setting. The building loomed darkly against the fading light, each window seeming to watch them with a cold, silent gaze. Jessica's heart pounded as they climbed the stairs, every step filling her with a growing sense of dread. When they finally reached her room, she hesitated, her hand hovering over the door handle. "It'll be okay," Mark whispered, though his own voice shook. "We'll get her back." Jessica nodded, steeling herself, and pushed the door open. Inside, the room was cold, colder than it had ever been, as if some invisible force had drained all warmth from the space. Sarah sat on her bed, facing the wall, her back to them. Her head was tilted at an odd angle, and she was humming that eerie, familiar tune that had haunted Jessica's dreams. "Sarah?" Jessica called softly, stepping into the room. The air was thick, suffocating, and she could feel that same malignant presence pressing down on her, watching her every move. Sarah turned slowly, her face a mask of blankness, her eyes empty and dark. But as she looked at Jessica, a strange smile spread across her lips, twisting her features into something inhuman. "You shouldn't have come back, Jessica," she whispered, her voice layered with echoes, as if multiple voices were speaking in unison. Jessica took a step back, gripping Mark's arm as they moved cautiously into the room. "Sarah, please, if you're still in there, fight it. Don't let it control you," she pleaded, her voice wavering. But Sarah only laughed, a sound that was both hollow and filled with malice. "Sarah isn't here anymore," she sneered, her voice shifting from mocking to coldly furious. "She let me in willingly. She wanted me here." Mark stepped forward, holding up the medallion as he muttered something under his breath. A prayer or incantation Jessica couldn't understand. The entity flinched, the smile faltering as it recoiled slightly, its gaze shifting to the medallion in Mark's hand with a look of loathing. Seeing this, Mark took another step, tossing a handful of salt in a circle around them. "Whatever you are, you're not welcome here," he said firmly, his voice stronger than Jessica had ever heard it. "Leave her alone. Leave this place." The entity's face contorted with rage, and it let out a screech that sent shivers down Jessica's spine, a sound that seemed to come from deep within Sarah's chest, raw and unnatural. It lunged toward them, but stopped short at the edge of the salt circle, recoiling as though struck by an invisible force. "You think you can banish me?" it hissed, its voice filled with venom. "I was here before you, and I'll be here long after you're gone. Sarah is mine." Jessica's heart ached as she looked at her friend's twisted form, feeling helpless and terrified. But Mark wasn't done. He reached into his bag, pulling out the sage and lighting it, filling the room with smoke as he chanted in a language Jessica didn't recognize. The entity let out another shriek, this one laced with fury and fear. Its form flickered, momentarily losing its grip on Sarah's body. For a brief, agonizing moment, Jessica saw Sarah's true face emerge, her eyes wide with terror, her mouth forming the words, "Help me," before the entity's shadow swallowed her once again. But Jessica wasn't about to give up. She reached forward, grabbing Sarah's hand, feeling the icy cold of her skin as she squeezed it tightly. "Sarah, I know you're in there. Fight it. Don't let it win." The entity thrashed, clawing at Jessica's arm, its fingers digging into her skin painfully. But she held on, refusing to let go, even as tears streamed down her face. Finally, with a final burst of effort, Mark shouted the last words of his incantation, and the entity let out a howl of pure agony, its form flickering and shifting. Slowly, it began to peel away from Sarah's body, a dark shadow detaching itself like smoke dissipating in the air. As the last of the entity faded, Sarah collapsed, her body falling limp as Jessica caught her, holding her friend close as relief washed over her. They sat there for what felt like an eternity, clinging to each other in silence. The room felt lighter, the oppressive weight finally lifted, but both knew they would never forget the horrors they had endured. Finally, Sarah looked up, her face pale and exhausted, but her eyes clear. "Jess," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's gone, isn't it?" Jessica nodded, smiling through her tears. "Yes, Sarah, it's gone." But even as they embraced, a chilling thought lingered at the edge of Jessica's mind, an unshakable feeling that she couldn't quite banish. Somewhere in the shadows, she could almost swear she heard that same, faint humming. The days following the exorcism felt surreal. Jessica and Sarah tried to resume their routines, but the weight of their ordeal lingered, casting a shadow over their every action. Though Sarah had returned to her usual self, she seemed haunted, often falling into long silences, her gaze distant, as if she could still feel the entity's cold grip. Jessica, too, found herself glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see that dark shape lurking in the corners. One night, unable to sleep, Jessica decided to check the camera footage once more. She knew it was a terrible idea, but a part of her needed to be sure that the entity was truly gone. With hesitant fingers, she pressed play and began to fast-forward through the footage. For the first few hours, the recording showed nothing unusual, just Sarah and herself sleeping peacefully. Jessica almost sighed with relief, thinking perhaps it was finally over. But at exactly 3:13 a.m., the screen flickered, just for a split second. Jessica's heart sank as she rewound the footage, watching intently. She saw a faint movement in the corner of the room, a shadow stretching out, dark and sinister, creeping closer and closer to her bed. The shadow was subtle, almost too faint to notice, but it was there, unmistakably. In the dim light of her laptop, Jessica watched as the shadow formed a vaguely humanoid shape. It loomed near her bed, silent and still, watching her sleep. And then it did something that made her blood run cold. It reached out, ever so slowly, as if it were brushing its fingers through her hair. Jessica felt sick, her stomach twisting in terror. She slammed the laptop shut, trying to control her breathing. Had it ever truly left, or had it been lingering in the darkness, waiting for its chance to return? The next day, Jessica confronted Sarah. She hesitated, unsure how to even begin, but Sarah's eyes told her that her friend was feeling it too. The dark presence hadn't been banished. It had merely hidden itself, waiting in the shadows, feeding off their fear. "We need to end this," Jessica said firmly. "For good." Sarah nodded, her expression determined despite the fear lingering in her eyes. They knew they couldn't go on like this, constantly looking over their shoulders, forever haunted by a malevolent force. With Mark's help, they decided to return to the dorm that night and face whatever was still lurking within those walls. As the clock neared midnight, Jessica and Sarah sat side by side in their dorm room, clutching their makeshift protection items and reciting the few chants and prayers Mark had taught them. They waited in tense silence, every tick of the clock echoing ominously in the quiet room. At 3:13 a.m., the air in the room changed. It became dense, almost suffocating, as though all the warmth and light were being drained away. Shadows stretched along the walls, twisting and flickering, and a familiar chill washed over them. Then, from the corner of the room, the shadow began to take shape once more. Jessica and Sarah clutched each other's hands, their hearts pounding as the figure emerged fully, darker and more solid than it had ever appeared. It was no longer a mere shadow, but a twisted form with hollow, empty eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness. It watched them with a cold, predatory gaze, and Jessica could feel it, its hunger, its malevolent need to torment them. "Leave us alone," Jessica shouted, her voice echoing through the room. The entity tilted its head, a mocking grin spreading across its featureless face. It took a step forward, and then another, as if savoring their terror. Jessica and Sarah backed up until they felt the wall against their backs, trapped as the entity loomed closer. Just as it reached them, Mark appeared at the doorway, holding a small, battered book. He began to recite the incantation he had prepared, his voice strong and steady, cutting through the oppressive darkness. The entity recoiled, its face twisting in rage, and it let out an inhuman shriek that rattled the walls. With each word, the entity seemed to weaken, its form flickering as if it were struggling to maintain its grip on reality. Mark continued, his voice unwavering, even as the entity thrashed and writhed, its movements growing more frantic. Jessica felt a surge of hope as she watched the entity's form begin to dissolve, pieces of it breaking apart like ash caught in the wind. But then, just as it seemed the incantation was working, the entity let out a final, piercing scream, and a wave of dark energy surged through the room, knocking Mark to the floor. Silence fell, heavy and suffocating, as the three of them struggled to regain their senses. Jessica's head spun, her vision blurry, but as she blinked, she realized with horror that the entity was still there, watching them with a look of pure hatred. "I won't leave," it hissed, its voice low and venomous. "You're mine." Summoning every ounce of courage, Jessica stood up, stepping toward the entity. "No," she said firmly, her voice trembling but resolute. "You don't belong here. You've taken enough from us. Leave." The entity seemed to falter, its expression flickering between rage and something else, a hint of fear. It lashed out, its form twisting, but Jessica held her ground, refusing to back down. She felt Sarah's hand on her shoulder, and together they faced the entity, their combined determination a force of its own. Mark, recovering from the blast, joined them, and together they repeated the final lines of the incantation. The entity screamed, its form unraveling, pieces of shadow flaking away, dissolving into nothing. With one last, furious shriek, it vanished, its presence finally dissipating, leaving only a faint, bitter cold in its wake. Jessica, Sarah, and Mark stood there in stunned silence, the weight of what had just happened settling over them. The room felt lighter, the darkness lifted, but they knew that they would carry the scars of this night for the rest of their lives. As the first light of dawn broke through the window, Jessica and Sarah held each other tightly, grateful to be alive, grateful to be free. The nightmare was finally over, or so they thought. In the weeks that followed, they both moved out of the dorm, too haunted by the memories to stay. They lost touch with each other, unable to bear the reminders of what they had endured together. But every now and then, Jessica would wake in the middle of the night, her skin prickling with a familiar chill, her heart racing as a faint, mocking whisper echoed in her mind. And in those moments, she couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, in the darkness, the entity was still watching, waiting. It had let them go for now,